Good morning, everyone. It's important to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples whose traditional territories on which we're gathered. We acknowledge the treaty territory of the Anishinaabe, which is defined within the pre-Confederation treaty known as the London Township Treaty of 1796. Throughout time, this region has also become the current home to the Haudenosaunee and the Lunapiwak nations. I'd like to acknowledge the many long-standing treaty relationships between Indigenous nations and Canada, and we recognize that all levels of government in Canada have a responsibility to honor the nation-to-nation relationship, and individually, we all have a role to play in honoring the treaties and contributing to reconciliation. Let me say thank you to all of you for joining us for What's Next. It's a conversation about London's recovery. We are fortunate to have four incredible thought leaders with us today. To each of you, thanks for your willingness to contribute to this important work, because it truly matters. Just a few months ago, during my State of the City address at the Chamber of Commerce, I spoke of, and I quote this, brutal honesty and credible hope. It was a central theme of my speech, a mantra of sorts. And I hope we can approach the work that lays before us in the same way. Because in order to provide credible hope to our community throughout this process, we must be brutally honest with each other. Kind, always. Brutally honest, no option. We have the benefit of hindsight. We know where we've been, we know where we are, and now we must chart a path to where we're headed. Where is one thing? How we get there is something else entirely, and that's why the work of the London Community Recovery Network is so vital and so urgent. Over the last 12 plus months, we've heard on countless occasions that these are unprecedented times. I believe these times also present us with an unprecedented opportunity, a truly unique and once in a lifetime opportunity to build a more prosperous, more equitable, and more innovative London, Ontario. The change begins now. The work starts here. We've got a city to love, so let's wrap our arms around it, put our heads together, and do right by our families, friends, neighbors. Let me say especially to all of you in the audience, thanks so much for your participation, both in the past and what you're doing by your participation today. And perhaps thanks most of all for caring. It truly matters in our community. So let me pass it back over to you, please, Megan.
Thanks so much, Mayor Holder. And thanks to all of you joining us today. We're going to have a conversation about London's community recovery. It's going to be great. My name is Megan Stacey, and I'm the City Hall reporter at the London Free Press. I'm really excited to learn from these four experts about ways that we can really build back better after the pandemic. So this morning, we're going to hear from four incredible thought leaders who will be sharing their perspectives on how London can position itself for a strong, deep, and inclusive recovery. First, we're going to hear from Mike Moffitt. Mike is the Senior Director of Policy and Innovation at the Smart Prosperity Institute and an assistant professor in the Business, Economics, and Public Policy Group at Ivey Business School at Western University. In 2017, Mike was the Chief Innovation Fellow for the Government of Canada, advising deputy ministers on innovation policy and emerging trends. From 2013 to 2015, Mike served as an economic advisor to Liberal leader Justin Trudeau. So Mike's going to kick us off today. He's by discussing economic trends to consider as we start that community recovery planning. Take it away, Chris.
Well, thank you so much for having me here today. So I think when we're trying to figure out, what a post-pandemic world looks like, and we will get there eventually, although it seems like it's taking longer than any of us would like. And as all levels of government think on how to build back better, a message we heard last night from President Biden in the United States, there's four things that I think we need to think about. The first is, there's a bunch of forecasts out there, Bank of Canada, the charter banks, everybody's trying to make forecasts, and there's a lot of uncertainty. This is an environment we have not seen in 100 years. So we don't know exactly how this is going to play out. So, instead of trying to sort of forecast, I think we need to have a bit of sort of foresight and think about possible futures, because there are a lot of, I would say, known unknowns here. We know, for instance, during the pandemic, that job loss was disproportionately among women, disproportionately among younger Canadians and younger Londoners, and particularly persons of color. We don't know how quickly that's going to bounce back yet. We've also seen on the sort of other side of the spectrum, high income individuals who have actually done fairly well financially during this crisis. They haven't gone on vacations, they haven't been driving their cars, haven't been commuting. They've saved a lot of money and they've pumped that into everything from Bitcoin to stocks to the real estate market. And it's, one of the reasons why we've seen 40% real estate gains in the London market over the last 12 months. We don't know how much that's going to continue. So we have to sort of prepare for a bunch of different eventualities. So the second point I would make, though, is that we can, if we're trying to sort of do some foresight, I think we can break down things into three buckets. The first is that things that are likely to go in the opposite direction once we're all vaccinated and this pandemic is over. Things that we all kind of miss. So we know the vacations are going to go back up. I think we're all going to go cheer on the London Knights when we can finally do that next year. I'm going to go get a haircut. So all of these things, we're going to see this sort of pent up demand, this sort of pressure cooker effect. There'll be a bunch of other things that don't change as well. But then this third bucket would be things that are permanent changes. And I would believe, looking again at sort of past events, that the most likely permanent changes are going to be things that were already happening before the pandemic. Things that, were already trends that the pandemic simply accelerated. And I think there's three big ones that we need to consider. The first is shopping from home. E-commerce had been going, up, in some cases doubling year over year. In the first 8 weeks of this pandemic, we had as much growth in e-commerce as we did in the previous 8 years. We basically had 8 years worth of growth in 8 weeks. So this was a trend and already, so it's something that's likely to persist. Second is work from home. We're seeing this. So Indeed, the big job board site, they were saying that, but they came out with some statistics just yesterday that said before the pandemic, about 3.8% of their job postings said that the work could be done remotely. And that was, back about 18 months ago. Now it's over 11%. So that's something that's likely to persist. That are all jobs going to be remote? Probably not. And I would, in fact, say most probably won't be. But that percentage, which had been growing over time, and we've actually seen this in the London area over the last 5 or 6 years, we've seen an influx of families move in from the Toronto area and oftentimes still have jobs in Toronto, but be telecommuting to those jobs. That's a trend that's likely to continue. And then finally, learning from home. There are, some people who have found that they learn more on Zoom. They like this format. So the demand for this format may continue. And we've seen that again over the last 20 years. There had been, more and more uptake of virtual courses. That's likely to continue. So my third point I would say is all of these create both threats and opportunities. And I think it's incumbent on governments, on business, on civil society, organizations to try and minimize the threats and maximize the opportunities. Shop from home, for instance, is a bit of a threat. If you're a smaller business, you may, concern yourself about losing business to Amazon, and rightfully so. I know municipal governments are particularly worried that if a lot of brick and mortar retail goes under, those businesses employ a lot of people, pay a lot of municipal property taxes. What happens there? But there's also an opportunity. And I think the opportunity for small business is if they're able to get themselves online, now they go from having a small regional market to be able to sell anywhere in the world. So trying to figure out how we can get our small businesses online rather than saying, okay, well, shop from home is a threat, we need to stop it. It's a bit like stopping the tides. Instead, we need to sort of figure out how we can get that to work to advantage to our small businesses. Same from work from home. Obviously, it's an opportunity for a lot of us. It's an opportunity for our businesses to hire the best and brightest among the world. It's an opportunity for those of us who don't enjoy commuting so much. But it's also a threat, and it's a threat that it's kind of opened our labor market up to global competition. As I like to say, if your job can be done from a beach in Thailand, it can also be done by the guy who's never left Bangkok. So we've seen that sort of global competition and what that's meant for industries like manufacturing. That could be happening to other jobs as well. So again, work from home is both a threat and an opportunity, and we need to sort of navigate that. And then finally, learn from home. I am at Ivy. I am one of those people now who might be open to global competition, who say, okay, well, I don't need to be in London, and I don't need to listen to Mike Moffitt because I could just take this virtual course somewhere else. So obviously that's a threat to our higher education, but it's also an opportunity, and it's an opportunity for places like Ivy to reach audiences that we've never been able to reach before. So again, it's trying to figure out how to navigate that. And then the final thing I would add is, although COVID is so top of mind to all of us, we can't overlook all of these other sort of mega trends that were happening. So the big population boom that London was having, the home price escalation we were having before the pandemic, and the big one that I focus on in my day job is Canada's race to net zero. Right, there is both a large threat and a very large opportunity for us. And I think at a community level, we should look at all of our emissions, whether it comes from buildings or transport or agriculture. We need to ratchet those down to zero. And I think we should see that as an opportunity. We should see that as an opportunity to create the jobs and the technologies that will help not just London get there, but other communities across the world. There's a real economic opportunity through decarbonization. So although, COVID is so top of mind for all of us, we can't forget all of these other things that are going on and all the sort of threats and opportunities that they present. So I will leave it there. I'm really looking forward to hearing the other speakers and hearing your questions. So again, thank you for having me.
Thanks so much, Mike. For those of us who are used to reading your thoughts, reading your insights, it's really nice to hear from you directly, or as directly as we can get on Zoom anyway. So next we're going to hear from Andrew Trunalol. He's the CEO of the Community Foundations of Canada. Andrew lives in London, Ontario, where he was born and raised, and his work is really rooted in community. It takes him across Canada to better understand how communities build resiliency. Community foundations are local organizations with a great depth of local knowledge and convening power to help prioritize issues that matter most to the community. So today, Andrew's going to give us a little bit of discussion about civil society, the role of community enterprises, and how we can harness the collective effort. Take it away, Andrew.
Thanks, Megan, and appreciate the opportunity to be part of this conversation. I think Mike provided a great segue, actually. The last 14 months have given rise to new language and language that will influence our future and set Canada and London on a new pathway. And as Mike mentioned, we're hearing that new language every day: build back better, as Joe Biden talked about last night, but also words such as transformation or a just recovery. And I'm sure all of you have become familiar with these words and phrases as they tend to show up everywhere in the last year or so. In fact, we are part of the London Community Recovery Network panel today, and the word recovery does mean something. The word recovery, according to Google, suggests that recovery is a return to a normal state of health, mind, or strength. Or it could also mean the process or action of regaining possession or control of something that has been taken away from us or something that's been lost. And I would ask, how many people feel as though they've lost something or that they've lost control? This new language, or the word recovery, isn't simply aspirational or prophetic. It provides much needed context to the key issues plaguing our communities, particularly London. And those key issues being grief and inequality. Now you may ask, why grief? Well, we've lost so much during the last 14 months. We have lost personal connection to our communities and to our families. How many vacations have been canceled? How many weddings have been postponed? How many funerals took place without the opportunity to grieve with others or to pay your respects in person? How many birthdays and anniversaries were celebrated over Zoom instead of in the comforts of homes and backyards? How many students missed the opportunity to have an in-person graduation ceremony? And how many of us are just simply isolated and separated from others? On an individual basis, these all seem like fairly small, mundane one-offs. However, the cumulative impact of all of these things, of all of these losses over the past 14 months creates sadness, disappointment, and of course, grief. In addition to grief, many Londoners have suffered the continued exacerbation of inequality. As Mike mentioned, small businesses have closed, jobs have been lost, parents have been taken away from work and redeployed in the home to facilitate online learning. And the spirit of business and social entrepreneurship has been stifled under these restrictive conditions. Economic inequality is alive and well in London, Ontario. In fact, 91% of Canadians think that economic inequality exists in Canada. According to the Canadian Parliamentary Budget Officer, the top 20% of Canadians hold somewhere between 67 and 72% of the overall wealth in Canada. The bottom 40% hold somewhere between 1 and 2% of the overall wealth in Canada. London is no different. Rising economic and social inequality threatens the social cohesion of our country and our peaceful democracy. We should also acknowledge, and Mike referred to this, that we are at the advent of building a new economy, a new outlook, and a new psychology that will address inequality unlike the way that we have seen it in the past, and also allow us to grieve all that has been lost. The question that remains in front of us as Londoners is this: what is the role of our city and our communities in this new economy? How will we address the key issues plaguing us, i.e. inequality and grief? And how will we bake this in to recovery? Let's go back to the definition of recovery. Do we want to return to normal as we know it, as we understood it, as we lived in it? Or do we want to forge ahead with a new type of normal? Londoners and Canadians want transformation, especially those suffering economically and emotionally during the pandemic. But what does transformation mean? We throw this word around a lot. William Bridges is an author and was a leading expert on transformation. And Bridges juxtaposes change and transformation as follows. Change is situational. Transformation, on the other hand, is psychological. It is not those events, but rather the self-redefinition that you have to go through in order to incorporate any of those changes into your life. Without transformation, a change is just a rearrangement of the furniture. Unless transformation happens, the change won't work. As city leaders, we need to stop rearranging furniture. We must strive for transformation. Incremental changes will not serve London well in the 21st century. A just and equitable recovery demands that from us. Now, under the frame of recovery and transformation, people matter. We must dismantle racism everywhere we see it. London must lead on equity and inclusion and promote a future where everyone belongs. Philanthropy and nonprofits must reshape their role in this new economy, meaning a robust acceleration of social enterprises to create more meaningful jobs and address London's most pressing challenges. We need real, on-the-ground connection to those in the community most impacted, not a savior model, but a real, authentic engagement that values the voices of those impacted and recognizes that we need to give something up. We must also recognize that place matters. Place-based and local matters, and building local economies that are inclusive. Where are the new business and financing mechanisms for these local economies? We have to ask those questions. Planet matters. We are interconnected as people to the natural environment around us. In fact, we're called the forest city. We cannot recover and rebuild without accepting this. This is not an environmental sector problem. This is an opportunity for us to do better and to value our planet and our place. Partnership matters. We need a coordinated approach between local government, business, nonprofits, and social enterprises to ensure that London can do its part and craft its role in the new economy. Recovery is not returning back to normal. It's about creating a future that is new and different and brings everybody into it. And so the question remains, how will London participate in this new economy? Back to you, Megan.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I have not heard a phrase as good as we don't just want to rearrange the furniture in some time. That's really awesome. And I love the challenge, to the folks in power and also to all of us about how are we going to challenge that old normal? We don't even want to go back there. I suspect we're going to hear a little bit more about this from our next speaker. That's going to be Romina Morris. Romina is an equity and inclusion expert providing consulting and coaching services to organizations and leaders who are committed to affecting change. She spent over 15 years in leadership positions where she's managed diverse teams in the human services sector. Romina is going to discuss building an equitable and inclusive recovery with deliberate approaches for all.
Thank you, Megan, and thank you for having me here today. I do have to say, as we're talking about future and what things will look like on the other side of this pandemic, as we're in the midst of this third wave, I do feel some optimism and some hope in terms of forward thinking. And to sort of honor what the recovery networks, one of their guiding principles is the commitment to embed equity and inclusion within the recovery pieces. And so and it kind of piggybacks on what some of the things that Andrew was talking about. We as a city, but as a global community, have been doing some horrendous things to the climate. We've not been treating that well. And we've been doing some really atrocious things to our people as well, all pre-pandemic. And now we have this sort of collision of crises, this kind of perfect storm where the pandemic has literally brought us all to our knees. It's created this pause, this opportunity to reflect and to really look at what we were not doing well. It's really shone a light on racial injustice. And I would, we've all kind of slowed down and bore witness to what happens when racial injustice is at play. And I would even argue that racism in and of itself has done far more harm than the pandemic has done. So with that being said, with this sort of piggybacking on what Mike and Andrew have both talked about in terms of creating a change in a different future, those people who are saying, we want things back to normal, back the way they were, are typically people who are finding that things were running okay for them in life. But those who are coming from equity deserving groups would say, no, the way that it was never serving us to begin with. And so we have this really good opportunity to sort of reframe how we do things and really embed these principles into our work. But how do we do that? What does that actually look like when the rubber hits the road? What does it mean to embed equity and inclusion in this kind of an uptake of recovery, both social and economic? And I would urge you to even just start where you are in terms of who is here today. People who are coming to the recovery network to sort of represent their organizations are typically in leadership. And so leaders, as we go up the ladder in organizations and up the hierarchical ladder, tend to get more and more homogeneous, right? The group tends to be from the dominant group. We're being tasked with looking at outcomes that will actually improve things for people that are in equity deserving groups, but the people making those decisions are not from those groups. So right here, within the bodies that are here talking and learning and wanting to be a part of the change, there's an opportunity here because people in equity deserving groups have consistently said, we need a place at the table. Our voices matter. We have solutions and you're not listening. It's a great opportunity right here and right now to consider, can you step back? Can you take an opportunity here to tap somebody within your organization that is from an equity deserving group and say, hey, got an opportunity here for you to step up and show your leadership skills, bring your diverse voice to a place and a space that could really affect change within this city. You can still be abreast of what's going on. You can still know everything that's happening, but you can do it from the sidelines. Because as Andrew said, sort of taking our power and privilege and giving up some of that to allow others to have a seat at the table is inherently what has been asked for. It's what's been demanded. This is an opportunity for that to happen right here and right now. In the absence of that, or in addition to that, when we're making decisions about what we do next and how we rebuild, we have to factor in those voices that are not at the table, right? So this is about partnership, consultation, co-developing with partners that are from racialized groups, that are from equity deserving groups, so that the answers are coming together, as opposed to people in the dominant group making decisions that may not actually benefit those people that they're claiming to serve. When we talk about creating solutions, we're talking about making things better for Londoners, right? Who is a Londoner? When I say Londoner, what's the image that pops into your mind? Is it a Muslim woman wearing hijab? Is it a transgendered youth? Is it a Black elderly man? What about an Indigenous mother and child? And if not, why not? Because I'll be honest, it's not the first image that comes into my mind either. But if we're not thinking about those Londoners, then we're not doing what we say we are embedding into the work. So how do we bring those voices to the table? Within this network, there are ways I've just talked about, but within your organizations, it's about going to those people. As leaders, we trip up. We think we have to know, we have to have the answers. That's why we're in leadership. And it's a false narrative, because leadership is partnership. So if we can step back from that idea that we need to have all the answers and actually ask the questions of the people that are going to be impacted by these decisions, then we can actually make some real change. So going to those people and asking them what they want is really inherent to sort of making this a reality, so that the outcomes actually affect those people that we're talking about serving. In terms of organizations, there's a need definitely to consider, because as we've already established, and I know most people know, that there are certain groups, all within equity deserving groups, that have been significantly impacted by the pandemic. Women, as we've talked about already, they're leaving in droves. They're leaving from the workplace. And this is a tragedy. This 2021, we were still talking about pay equity, and now we've lost all these women out of the workforce. And a big part of that is because, there was, before the pandemic, there was this myth that women were living thinking that we could do it all. We could have a full-time career, we could have our families and raise them, we could take care of our elderly parents, we got this. And it's a myth, and people were already cracking and finding really a lot of stress in trying to juggle all of these things. The pandemic has just shone a spotlight on all of that, that the reality is this is very, very difficult. And so how can you be creative in terms of trying to honor and keeping women in the workforce? People are leaving because they need to juggle home responsibilities. Can we offer women a year, or others, a year sabbatical? Don't leave altogether. Just take the time you need for now, and we'll take you back when you're ready. Can we create flexible? I mean, we want to talk about flexibility. We never imagined we could work from home the way that we are. Those of us that are privileged to do so. Can we create shorter work weeks for folks, flexible hours? There is a need for us to be really responsive to the moment. And again, this is not things that we're not being asked of before, but now we know, having never imagined being here, that we can do things that we hadn't thought about. Mental health is a big piece, and we're all struggling, as Andrew talked about, like socially, we are social beings, and that has all been taken away from us. So we are all struggling. But we have to consider the intersectionality of people who are struggling in general, and then those who are in racialized bodies, who are in disabled bodies, who are experiencing all kinds of other things that were already very difficult to navigate. Folks who get out of their bed, go to work, and come home, and we're struggling dealing with microaggressions all day, every day, and really impacting their mental health. Now that is just that much more at play. So how do you honor those folks when they come back into the workplace? How do you support your employees when they are dealing with so many multiple things? There are some organizations that are doing some great work who are offering a new uptake on what benefits look like. Stop with the contracts, get some permanent positions in so folks can tap into benefits. And when I say benefits, I'm talking reviewing what you have already, right? Allowing people to have an extraordinary amount of mental health services and physical well-being. There are organizations that are offering personal training, recognizing that physical and emotional well-being is what brings people to the workplace as their best selves. Childcare, opportunities for sort of being creative around how we can honor all of these different things, is paid sick days. Like, we know that this is what allows people to thrive in the workplace. Otherwise, we are just falling short all day and every day. So how do we prevent people from burning out? And when they do come back into the workplace, those are some tangible things that can be done. And it's an investment up front, yes, but the return is so great because then you have people who feel like they can show up and do their best work for you. So there's a number of things I could go on, and I think we'll have a lot of good conversation in terms of how this takes up. But the big piece here is that within the power and the privilege that you have, it's really incumbent upon you to look within and see within yourself and within your organization how you can do this work differently, what needs to be shifted. How status quo is what got us here, and that's not what we're looking for at this point. But in order to have what is really the tall order for today, I'll finish with this, is we need creativity and we need innovation. And I'll go back to my first point in terms of, if you have a homogeneous group making those decisions, you have neither of those two things. In order to have creativity and innovation, you need diversity. Diversity of thought, diversity of lived experience, diversity of professional experience. When you bring those people together collectively, creativity and innovation is absolutely what happens. And this is a time where we keep saying unprecedented, but what we mean is it's never happened before. So that means that what we come out of this and what it looks like is something that we've never seen before. So with that, I will take a step back, hand it back to Megan, and I look forward to more conversation as we go on with the morning.
Thank you so much, Romina. I mean, a call to action there for us to tackle, I love that phrase, the collision of crises, right? And we're really going to have to do that. So we're going to hear a little bit next from Graham Henderson. Graham joined the London Chamber of Commerce as CEO on March 22nd of this year, and he's serving as the voice of business in London. So Graham brings over 20 years of executive leadership. He served as the CEO of Music Canada, where he helped to shape perceptions of Canada's music community as an economic and cultural driver, both nationally and internationally. This morning, Graham is going to discuss small business development, business resilience, and economic planning and strategy. Thanks so much, Graham.
Or I will try to. You know, you introduced me as the voice of business. I you know, two things I'd say about that. I'm very new to the community, so I'm still struggling to find my own voice. But, you know, in light of what Romina's just said and others, I really think that business may be struggling to find its voice. And I feel that that is a transformation that the Chamber and other businesses have to go through, is to decide, okay, what is our voice now? Because it really has to be different. And to the point that has been made about, you know, we don't want that old world. As you know, I come from the music world and I'm married to a musician. And I can tell you that that group, the last thing they want back is that world. It is absolutely essential that we forge a new ecosystem in which musicians and songwriters and producers and other creative folks can thrive. So I want to talk a little bit today about what I think business can do. And a lot of it, Romina, is echoing things that you have brought to our attention. But I also want to give a little, I think there's a couple of things that we tried to do at Music Canada that maybe show that it can be done. And I think it can be done here. So first of all, leadership and accountability. If we're going to transform ourselves, then we have to, as businesses, build the business case for diversity and inclusion. And there are a variety of ways that we can do that. For one thing, you know, we can use procurement methodologies to incentivize diversity and inclusion. But also, we need to include equity-seeking groups within our, and this was Romina's point, in our leadership. And the way we did that at Music Canada, which is, I'm sure lots of other groups have done it, but I had a board that consisted of myself and 3 other white men because of the structure of Music Canada. And we changed our bylaws to increase that number to 5. I stepped off my own board, making room, and we brought 2 women on, one of whom was a person of color, and the other woman became our chair, and they were from outside music. I then created an advisory council of 15 people who we carefully selected, and it ended up, I think there were 8 members of the BIPOC community, 7 women, or that might have been the other way around, 2 LGBTQI. So there was a real effort that went into making available to me as a decision maker those voices. Childcare. I think affordability of childcare is going to be something that is critically important. We have a shortage of early childhood educators that can be addressed. And, you know, we've got a lot of empty space in our offices now. Is there an opportunity for workplace-based childcare? That's, to me, an opportunity that businesses have consistently sidestepped for years. Workforce development, reskilling those who have been most disadvantaged. And I agree with everything that has been said before about those people who have been disadvantaged. It is not people like me. Entrepreneurial training, you know, we did a lot of research at Music Canada trying to understand what the creator community needed, the artist community. And one of the things that we discovered was they lacked entrepreneurial training. And that doesn't mean how to open a business account, you know, which is what a lot of people felt when we looked at the type of entrepreneurial training that was being offered to musicians. It was, okay, so now you open a business account. At the bank, of course, forgetting that most musicians who show up at a bank are like, you please leave. You're not welcome here. You don't have any money. Yes, I do. But I think, you know, I think if we can, and what we found with the musicians was, and the songwriters, that they needed that training. We lavish entrepreneurial training on those from the tech community who we know are disproportionately from certain demographic groups. Why can we not extend that to other groups? And finally, and it was mentioned also by a couple, is flex work. It was already always there, but now I think it becomes increasingly important. So, you know, there's a few areas where I think a very effective change can be accomplished. And I just wanted to add some other thoughts. You know, so I come from live music. I come from the music community. Live music is a very big part of that world. My wife tours all the time. And we are now, here's a little example. So we are now lavishing money in that sector because it's badly hurt. The live venues have been badly hurt. Money is being poured into it from the community. That means it's your money, taxpayers' money. So what are we saying to live music venues about how they use that money? And similarly, when governments give money to arts and cultures organizations, for example, what are we saying to them about how they use the money and who's on their board? And at this point, it seems to me to be nothing. And what I will say about speaking for example, my wife and other women in music, that live music environment is not a safe environment. It is not inclusive. It's not inclusive for women, and it's not inclusive for members of other equity-seeking groups. It's actually a very unsafe environment. So, will our venues spend money on putting a lock on the green room door? Will they spend money on a woman's bathroom so that my wife doesn't have to go to the bathroom in a men's room. Now, obviously, at the upper reaches of the live music sector, when we're talking about the Grand and the Aeolian and so on, and Massey Hall, these aren't problems, but they are very significant problems for those artists who are just starting out and entering the business. My wife had to sleep on band house floors all over the country, all over North America, in incredibly unsafe conditions. So there's an example of how, when we think about the reopening and what it might or might not look like, it's to say, how are you spending the money? And to tie the money to making infrastructure changes, for want of a better term. This is where infrastructure can actually help people, make them safer. And, and I've said, men and women's washrooms, like that's not what the music community looks like. It's not what our society, it's a binary choice. And for the Indigenous community, I mean, in the live music environment, where do you go to smudge? Oh, what? You have to do what? So lots of opportunity here, lots of inequity, as the people as folks have been pointing out, that needs to be, I'm just making sure, oh, I'm pretty good with my time, a couple more minutes. Not that I have that much more to say. Now, listen, there are really good groups that are doing something, like, for example, there's Raising the Bar, which is a group that is designed to make workplaces safe for women. Well, there's an organization that we can jump behind, surely, and get funding to. Last thing I want to just talk about is, and it's like you were on talking about, Romina, is our leadership. Arts and culture boards, and I'm not speaking about London, I don't know, but I can tell you what it was like in Toronto. They can be very, very monochrome. And that means people like me. So I think governments have significantly failed in recent years in tying funding to the makeup of boards. Demand a matrix, demand to know what, it's like, if you want any money at all, I want to see your diversity policy. Oh, you don't have one? Well, then you're not getting any money from us. Those sorts of inducements, I think, could offer real opportunity for change. And that's my 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Graham. And thank you to all four of our panelists. I have to say, this has never happened to me ever in a panel. We are ahead of schedule, which is great because we'll have more time for sort of the free flow. We're going to get into some questions. I really want to thank the audience and many of you who are watching right now for submitting your questions and, presenting some of those ideas that we will hopefully talk about for our last half an hour or so here. So I want to put out a question to all of you. First of all, it was so interesting to hear some of the overlap in your presentations, which I think is really heartening. And Romina spoke about how leadership is partnership. And I think that could be so powerful in London. We think of something like the Community Recovery Network. We've already got so many agencies, so many groups here ready to do the work. So, how do we bring together the knowledge from, the nonprofits, from our Indigenous communities, from government, from business, and create those, creative solutions without bogging everybody down in meetings and meetings and meetings and producing, reports and reports and reports? What does that actually look like? That kind of collaboration, that partnership that could be so powerful to helping us build back. Open to any one of you. Race to the unmute button here. Too polite. It can be any of you. Okay, Romina, let's go to you first. I spoke about your comment there, leadership is partnership. How do you see that happening, between these different sectors and between all of the wonderful people that we've got watching today, wanting to do that work and wanting to start, wanting to build a collaborative recovery?
Well, yeah, and to your point, the purpose of this launch is to really come up with a framework that has this common vision. And so, you know, it is interesting how all four of us have some common themes. And I think those are the themes that you run with, those where there is intersectionality between we all have different lived experiences and different work experiences, but there are some common things that we're talking about. So for me, it's right there. It's finding those places where there is an inherent overlap and bringing all of those voices to create that vision. People are not really struggling as much anymore in terms of recognizing what the work needs to look like in terms of who it serves, who we serve, and where the deficits have been before. So essentially, it's just really creating that vision based on all of what we've just talked about, so that everyone's needs are met. As Mike kind of highlighted, there are some folks who are doing exceptionally well during this time. We cannot forget that. So how do we lean into those folks to sort of support those who are not doing so well? How do we bridge everything together? That's the work. It's sort of finding some commonalities between those who are excelling right now and those who are absolutely destitute because of what's happened, and finding those partnerships to be able to bridge some of those gaps. So for me, it's about that common vision, and where those themes are, that is the work. It lays the foundation in terms of what the next steps are.
Yeah, maybe I'll just build on what Ramina's put on the table. And, you know, sometimes it doesn't always have to be a new thing or a new committee or a new institution. I think we've got really strong institutions in our community. We've got a university, a community college, hospitals, community organizations. We have large corporations, small businesses, and network and membership organizations that represent all of those constituencies. A few months ago, I went on websites of the large hospitals, the hospital foundations, the university, the college, community college, and numerous other influential and compelling organizations in our community. I looked at their governors and I looked at the leadership of those organizations. They represent London of the 1960s. They simply do not reflect the future of this community. We need people with lived experience. We need people representing the diversity of perspective across our communities. And right now, the city's values and puts a lot of emphasis on the voices that represent the top 20 or 30% in terms of socioeconomic mobility in our community. And that simply isn't going to cut it. We need healthcare that's informed by people that really rely on the healthcare system and use it routinely. Same with every other community organization. And diversity, equity, and inclusion is a critical feature of the recovery. And I think all the speakers have talked about that. And if there's something that we really need to emphasize in London, it is that. And so within existing institutions, not necessarily new ones.
And if I can just tap into what both you, Andrew, and Graham have said in terms of what the boards look like and what governance looks like, we have to remember that a lot of it is the inherent structures and the systems that are behind those organizations, but also people neglect to remember that being a board member, doing those kind of activities and serving the community is a privilege in and of itself. If you have the luxury of time that you can devote without any compensation, that's a privilege for people that we just talked about in terms of who are most significantly impacted. That is above and beyond what they can offer in terms of just the logistics of getting through daily life. And so there's a disconnect there for sure, that those who are privileged enough to volunteer their time are typically from the dominant group. There's a problem.
Yeah, and I'll add to that as well, that I find a lot of times, I'm speaking, so I teach at Ivy, but I also run an environmental think tank. When you've got a board position or workplace position, look at who's applying, because I find a lot of the time it tends to be sort of word of mouth or that kind of thing. So you end up fishing in this small pool, and I hear this over and over again from organizations like, oh well, we would hire a person with disability, but we just can't find them. They're out there. So I think, you need to really do a post-mortem of whenever you're hiring somebody for a board or a position, look at who's applying. And if it's not a cross section of the London society in general, then you've got to go back to the drawing board and say, okay, why are we not reaching these people? Like, what are the barriers? Why are they not hearing about these opportunities, or why are they not interested in these opportunities? And have to ask yourself some difficult questions, because we've had to do that in our own organization. Now, when I started at SPI about 2.5 years ago, everyone looked like me, and I just don't mean like unkempt hair and beards, though most environmentalists often do look like this. But that was the thing. And, we went through this process. We looked at who was applying. I'm like, okay, we've got a problem here, because we were doing so much by word of mouth that it was, it was all about who do you know rather than what do you know. And that can be exceptionally problematic.
And once you've got your people hired, businesses need to invest in their people. They should have, career counseling plans. They should have networking opportunities. They should have educational opportunities. They should provide professional development opportunities, and they should provide, personal development programs. And I think those sorts of activities, strategies need to be in the strategic plan of any business, and the leaders need to be held accountable for whether or not their people are invested in that way. And then the goal is to provide people with great careers and to provide equitable treatment, competitive compensation, and benefits. So I think a lot of that is, Romina, you talked about, or was it Andrew, talked about embedding, but that, embedding those sorts of objectives in strategic planning, and then providing measurement metrics, provides the accountability that's missing. Because I'm willing to bet a lot of those sorts of goals aren't in strategic plans.
This is great. Thank you guys so much. And I'm glad that we're getting to this, because we had a really compelling question too about community engagement. And how do you do that, in a time of COVID and post-pandemic too, when people may be unwilling or uncomfortable to get together physically. And I think this is an important layer. We're talking about the leaders, and we've got so many folks watching today who are, leaders or agencies, but that next layer of how do you get to the community, right? How do we pull in those voices? How do you break that kind of word of mouth change that Mike's talking about that just perpetuates, and as Andrew said, our 1960s era reflection on boards, right? How do we do that? How do we think about community engagement post-pandemic? And I've actually heard both things, that it's more challenging without being able to get people together, but even recently I've heard that that digital option can actually be really powerful and really helpful in a way, where you wouldn't see people show up at public meetings. They're now joining the Zoom. Does anybody want to give us a little bit of sense of how do we build on that community engagement? How do we kind of balance that once it may be safe to gather physically again?
Yeah, Megan, maybe I'll jump in on that question. I think we can learn a little bit from history as well. Coming out of World War II, Canada, much of the Commonwealth, were faced with rebuilding society and rebuilding community. And they really focused in on infrastructure. And we're hearing a lot about infrastructure investment these days. Certainly, Joe Biden's got a big plan called the American Rescue Plan. We released in Canada our federal budget just last week. And I think, when we go back in history, we looked at something called social infrastructure and establishing a social contract. And there were really wild, ambitious, innovative ideas at the time, things like universal healthcare, the Canada Pension Plan, universal access to education. Like, these were really wild and crazy ideas coming out of the Second World War, and not all political ideologies got behind them. But interestingly enough, here we are, 80 years removed from the war, or that particular war, and those have been the key elements of building the Canada that we currently have, which has served us quite well. And I find that we're at that moment again, We're not coming back from a traditional war per se, but we're going to be looking to rebuild community and rebuild society. And I think we have to think about infrastructure differently. We have to think about it in the context of social infrastructure. We are emphasizing the need to have affordable childcare. The federal government is setting up infrastructure that will help promote entrepreneurship among women, among Black people, and among Indigenous communities. And so this is really a focus in on place-based economic stimulus that really directs where help is needed precisely in the community. And it's not broad-based tax cuts for the rich. It's not broad-based tax cuts for large corporations. It's place-based economic stimulus. And I think if we can get those things going, and if we can really focus in on the social aspects of infrastructure, like our parks, places where people gather and connect. We have the Forks of the Thames here in London, Ontario. I know many people have gone to Winnipeg and see what their Forks looks like. And I think when we compare those two, we've got a lot of work to do. But we just have natural space here in the Forest City where people would love to connect, love to be outdoors, love to enjoy the fresh air. And we have to make investments in those places. So it's infrastructure, but it's also social infrastructure that will build the fabric of this community in our country.
Yeah, and I think that sort of in a way also brings us to downtown revitalization. We spent a lot of time studying the role of music in downtown revitalizations, looking in particular at Austin, Texas, which I believe is a very similar community to this one. It's not a hub. You have to go if you want. Well, in the day, if you wanted to go to Austin, you had to go to Austin. You had to want to go to Austin. It's sort of the same thing here. It's not like there's an airport hub or something, but by cultivating their surroundings, like they've got a river, they've got a lake, they cultivated it, they made it beautiful, they put walks along it, and they ensured that they solved their downtown homeless problem and the crime problem, and music was a big part of that. Culture in general was a big part of it, so we want young people to want to live here. We want people to feel safe in the downtown environment. I think there are very real strategies that we can invest in, which will fix that and sort of build a platform for the whole community.
Can I just add, in terms of what you said, Andrew, around the things that came out of the World War II and the universal healthcare and CPP, those are all targeted at the most vulnerable in the community, right? That's what that was about. So that's the same as right now. So to your point, that's it right there. Seemed wild and crazy at the time, but it's inherent to our what we take such pride in terms of our country in comparison to others. And so that's the order of the day. In terms of the conversation about the downtown space, and I know that that's been a lot of conversation at this network, and it has its place, no doubt. But also, can we also shift and put some investment into some of the underserved neighborhoods in London? Outdoor spaces for those kids who are in neighborhoods where they don't have park space that is optimal, they don't have access to sort of park structures and basketball nets and things. How do we keep them in mind at the same time? Because they may never be going downtown. That sort of draws people from certain groups, that draws people from other cities maybe who are visiting. So how do we, and I'm all about both and, it's not either or ever. So how do we do both? How do we ensure that the downtown is like arts and culture? Whose art? Whose culture? Are we really broadening that lens of what that looks like? Who are we inviting to the stages? Who are we honoring? Who are we serving? All of that within the downtown piece, and beautifying that is absolutely inherent, at the same time as looking around where there are neighborhoods that are not looking as beautiful for the reasons that we know, and it is because they are from vulnerable communities. So let's do it all.
And I think to your point, Romina, the pandemic has really laid bare, those realities and those inequities that we should have been noticing long before. But, when it comes to working at home, trying to balance your work and your kids, or whether it's learning at home, do you even have the tools that you need to get that done? What if you got multiple kids? Can we talk a little bit about that? I mean, what have those lessons taught us or shown us about the ways that we should be working and learning, going forward after the pandemic? That's how you know it's a bad question. Okay, let's go a little bit more in depth. I want to talk about the learning. We had quite a few questions come in from the community about, online learning. How do you shift towards online learning, and how do we balance mental health issues, especially that young people are facing as a result of the pandemic? So, does anybody have any thoughts about shifting the models of learning or the way that we learn in general? What do we need to keep in mind as we build back? Is it something where we need to be balancing, both the digital and the in-person in order to help kids who are struggling right now? How do we walk that fine line of those two options?
Yeah, well, it's pretty obvious who's been most affected by this, the schooling problems, the closures. And, I think of my son's school. He's fine because he's got a laptop and Wi-Fi access. But, half of the kids in his school came from a community where that was very unlikely. And if there was any internet access, it was rural, it could be dial-up. And these kids became some of them just disappeared. Like I think their parents threw up their hands. The kids were bowled over by it. And so if we're going to have a different online learning environment, it will have to be one that's accessible. And, and particularly, we think about the London area, there's a lot of people who don't have fiber optic. And so what are we going to do about that?
So sorry, Andrew.
Yeah, I just want to build on Graham's point, and I'm glad that Graham mentioned this because it's critical. Wi-Fi access and connectivity to the world is cutting across socioeconomic class lines, and it's not just in addition to it being an urban-rural issue. Think about where most of our Indigenous community lives, in the Canadian North, in the territories, and particularly during a time like the pandemic, being disconnected and even further isolated from the rest of Canada is tragic, and further exacerbates the very specific real issues that are playing out in Indigenous communities in Canada. Yeah. And I think we have to find a way to do better and to build the infrastructure that keeps all Canadians connected. We also have to look at the cost of being connected. There's a real household expense associated with having robust, fast internet connection speed. And if everybody's at home working and everybody's at home doing online learning, it puts a strain on that system. And those that can't afford to have the best devices or 5G access are inherently at a disadvantage, and then further creates inequality in our society. So I think we have to level the playing field. We have to make sure that much in the same way everybody has access to healthcare in this country, everybody needs to have access to the same level of bandwidth and the same level of connectivity so that they can enjoy basic things like being connected and learning and working.
And to the issue with the Indigenous communities, right? If you think about how the government first responded to the pandemic, they set up a whole range of different sources of relief. But, my recollection is that the Canada Emergency Business Account was not, it didn't really, it sort of excluded businesses on reserve where income isn't taxed. I think Bill C-414 left Indigenous owned businesses originally ineligible for Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy. I know that was corrected. And then the Business Credit Availability Program, it can't be used for the payment of dividends, which is a barrier to many of the Aboriginal Economic Development Corporations. So, perfect examples of where relief was poorly thought out and not correctly targeted. So.
Thanks to you all. So we have a couple of questions too, and I think it was interesting. All of you touched on the issue of climate change and climate and environmental issues, and how do we build back, with a greater focus there. So I'd like to hear from you a little bit about what that looks like in terms of pandemic recovery. How do we drive towards recovery, with that key focus, including a key pillar that, maybe we haven't given as much focus as we should have in the past.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I can speak to that. So if we look at climate change, emissions come from a variety of different sources, and you're going to need a variety of different technologies and a variety of different policies to address each. Emissions from transportation are somewhat different from emissions from buildings, from agriculture, and so on. And there are sort of cross-cutting policies that can help, obviously, like carbon pricing, but others need more of a targeted approach. But what I would say is that, again, this is sort of an opportunity to build back better. Here at SPI, we've been doing some work with Health Canada, looking at the sort of what we call co-benefits and co-costs of reducing emissions. So the idea is that, let's say you take a diesel bus, you take it off the road and you replace it with an electric bus. Obviously, there's an emissions savings there, but you're also reducing a bunch of other particulate matter. And we found in many cases, depending on the type of emissions, you actually get more savings to the healthcare system than you get from the actual sort of GHG benefits. So we need to think through the co-benefits. So one of the ways you can do that, I think, is for communities, and we've seen this sort of across North America, to do a mapping, to look at the areas that have the sort of worst air quality and target those. And there's a couple benefits to that. That first of all, those almost always end up being low-income communities, disproportionately people of color. Like the worst sort of air quality in Ontario tends to be the neighborhoods just south of the 401 in Toronto. So by doing that, by looking at these sort of hotspots, by saying, okay, where are the areas with the worst air quality? Can we do something on those? Where are the areas where, the communities where kids have to walk more than 5 to 10 minutes to get to a park? So doing this sort of gap analysis and then filling in those gaps, I think are one way at a community level, you can achieve both better GHG outcomes, but a variety of health outcomes. And on the park side, there's a lot of mental health benefits as well. So if I'm looking at the community level, doing that gap analysis, I think, is incredibly important.
Yeah, maybe I'll just build quickly on Mike's point there. Earlier in the year, Larry Fink, who runs BlackRock, largest asset manager in the world, called upon all the companies that BlackRock's invested in to demonstrate their commitment to a net zero economy. And I think what the way that people can have an influence is to take a look at how you're investing. And like I said before at the start, the top 20% of Canadians hold most of the wealth in the stock market. So it's not even that many people. But if you're taking a look at the companies that you're invested in, are they working? Do they have a plan towards a net zero economy? Are they thinking about the Paris Climate Agreement and how they make decisions? Are they linking the Sustainable Development Goals within their broader corporate goals and objectives? We do have a past where we tend to invest in companies that are exploitive, that are extractive, in pursuit of one goal, and that is maximizing returns. And so when we think about the new economy is not about prioritizing or maximizing returns in and of itself. We have to think about making money. We have to think about building capital, but we have to do it in a way such that it respects the economy and it respects the environment in which we live. And the only way for companies to be held accountable is for investors and shareholders to have a voice and to exercise where they're investing in and rewarding companies that do the best job of that. And that's something that all of us can participate in.
Well, and you can also include like you think about your typical shareholder type organization. Does it, is the board going to only be represented by shareholders, or are there other interests that can be represented on the board, which isn't tied to money?
We got a really interesting question that came in here, and I just want to lob it out before we wrap up. Someone was interested in hearing about a shift at work and a shift from, a time-based focus to an outcomes-based focus. Wonder if anybody wanted to take that, if we see that as a part of our recovery, and how that might help us build back. Romina, you're nodding. Let's go to you first.
Well, I mean, there it is. That's just a different way of looking at things, and it allows for people to really hone in on their skills and their strengths without these constraints that we're so accustomed to. So for me, that's a beautiful way to sort of come at this in a different manner. If I can get something done in 4 hours and that frees me up to manage my responsibilities, because that's my skill set, allow me that freedom and that flexibility to do so. And if it takes me longer, then let that be the case. But there's something to that, and it is sort of, it requires such a stretch. And because we're so accustomed to doing things a certain way, again, I go back to the fact that before the pandemic, we were all head down, running the rat race without a moment to pause, to breathe, to come up for air. And for some of us, particularly women in the workforce, just head above water, just being able to, so the flexibility that approach allows. Oh, we can breathe. Okay, I can work on a weekend and sort of hustle when my kids are in bed, or I can work around my lifestyle when I'm helping my mom here in the day, and then I can take her to an appointment, but I can still come back in the evening and put stuff out. It really opens up an opportunity for people to just show up in their best way, rather than these 9-to-5 kind of constraints. So I'm all about it. I think that's absolutely meeting a need for many, many people.
Yeah, so I'd like to again, sort of an organizational level. I am hopeful. The sort of silver lining on this is I am hopeful that the pandemic is going to create some changes that should have happened anyway. Canada has long had a productivity problem, and I think part of that productivity problem is from a managerial point of view is butts and seats thinking, like, we want you there 9 to 5, and we're not really sort of measuring output. So I'm hopeful we've done this as an organization, and I hope others do this as well, is invest in those tools to allow people to get those, those sort of project management tools, and those, all of those things that Canadian businesses have historically underinvested in. And I think you'll find that will allow people to work at different times, different hours, be more productive. And because I'm the same way, like I get more done between 4 and 6 a.m. I'm a parent of 2 special needs kids, so my days tend to be a little bit weird. And by having this tool allows us to sort of collaborate with my coworkers and get things done. So, as an organization, I think you need to be looking at what tools are out there to allow your employees to be more productive. And I think you'll find when you do that, you'll be able to time shift a bit more than you can now, and you won't be sort of you won't be measuring inputs so much as measuring outputs, which ultimately for any organization is what matters.
Mike, I think that actually is happening. I can't speak to every business, but certainly businesses that I was involved in. And it's interesting. I mean, it was the very first thing that we started to think about. We asked okay, what do you need to work from home? Yeah. And often people didn't think to say the right thing. They wouldn't say, well, I need a better chair. Oh, right. Of course you need a better chair. I'm working at a dining room table. It is up here, and so I think slowly, maybe not as quickly as we'd like, but businesses started to realize that if people are working from home, the tools have to be provided to them. And which goes back to the question, if people have those tools, then they will be able to work in that manner. I think it's a really good point.
It truly pains me to do this, but I promised I would be on time today. So I've got to close us off. Thank you so, so much to all four of you for these, I think really important and super compelling ideas and suggestions, and themes that we need to focus on moving forward. Thank you so much for being here virtually and for sharing with us. And I want to thank everybody who's tuned in today, or to anyone who might be catching up with us on the replay. It's so crucial that we get this recovery right. And I think, bringing us back down to some of these key goals and some of the pillars and the suggestions that all of you have mentioned today will hopefully be so helpful for us here in London. So thank you so much to all of our panelists again, and to all the folks who work behind the scenes to make this happen. So grateful, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks so much.
Dog barking. Perfect.